Welcome back to Rad JBI. I'm JB. Today I'm going to show you how to mount a set of forks onto a dirt bike. All right, the first thing you want to do is you want to verify the fork height that you're going to be installing the forks into the triple clamps. Now for this model bike and these model forks, they have a line that's been machined into the outer tube, and this line happens to be the spec we're going to be putting these forks in. Not every manufacturer has lines machined into their tubes. If those ones do not, the spec will usually be a fork tube height in millimeters, which tells you how tall the fork is going to be in the triple clamp. So we're going to go ahead and install these into the first line here. So that'll stick just above the triple clamp line here. You don't want any sort of lubricant such as oil or grease in that area, because that's not going to help hold the fork in place. So here's our line, and we're going to adjust this down a little bit to get it right where we want it. Cool. And then I'm also checking out the orientation of the sticker and our bleed screw to ensure that it's facing forward. It's easy to access the bleed screw and the stickers properly lined up. Now I'm just going to hand tight these bolts for just a moment, so that way the fork doesn't slide out of the triple clamps. Afterwards, we're going to go through and put our torque wrench on these and torque them down to the proper OEM spec. So just to go over it again, when you guys come and get a good up close view, you see we got the air screw pointed at the front of the bike, so it's easy to access. For some of you riders that like to run your handlebars in the forward position, you may want to mount your forks 180 degrees reverse in the back direction, so that way your bleed screw is in the back and it's easier to get to. Again, this will be for riders that utilize the handlebars in the front position when it comes to the mounting in the triple clamps. Starting with the top triple clamp, this 2025 Honda CRF 250R Works Edition, it calls for 16 foot-pounds for the torque spec. So we got our torque wrench right here. We got it adjusted to 16 foot-pounds. And you're going to notice that I'm applying the torque load equally to each bolt. So I'm not taking one bolt and going all the way in and reaching the torque spec that way. We want to apply it gradually and equally. And now the lower triple clamp takes 15 foot-pounds for the torque spec. Again, the top one was 16. The lower triple clamp is always going to be a lower torque spec compared to the top one. Cool, so we got our torque wrench set. So now that we know that we've properly torqued our triple clamps, we know our fork is in the proper height, which matches the other fork. It is now time for us to mount the lower fork guard and get ready to install the front wheel. All right, now it's time to mount up your front fork guard. Now you're gonna have 3 bolts or screws that take an Allen number 5, and they're gonna be very similar to the Allen number 5 screws you have that hold on your brake cover. Now, there's a big difference between the two in terms of the length of thread. It's very important you do not use these 2 longer ones inside of your fork guard bolt, because what will happen is if you do use a longer one, it is going to dent your inner tube because it goes through your axle bracket and it'll dent this tube on the inside. What happens is then the spring, which is in this area, will be very difficult to come out. Sometimes you can't even get it out. So it's very important to verify that the 3 screws you're using are all the same length and they're not the 2 longer screws for the brake disc cover. Now, if we want to look up the spec in the manual, it's about 7 foot-pounds for these small screws. As much as I trust my trusty torque wrench, for some of these smaller screws, I just kind of like to do them by hand if you've got a good feel for working on this stuff. Reason being is the thread length is pretty small. It's pretty easy to strip out these axle brackets. I like to utilize a small 1/4-inch drive ratchet when it comes to doing some of these smaller bolt sizes. I feel like it makes it a little more challenging to over torque these or strip them out from over torquing them. What I did was I started each bolt so that way the guard is kind of loose and you can get each bolt started inside of its threads, and then we can torque it down. If you go ahead and put the screw all the way in from the start, it sometimes can be more difficult to maneuver the fork guard around to get the rest of the bolts in. Cool, now we're just gonna do one whole pass and verify everything is tight. Now, don't worry about spinning this fork. You can spin this as many times as you want. It doesn't hurt it in any way. What holds this together is a series of seals, bushings, and circlips. So they're not directional in any mean. It doesn't hurt the fork tube to spin it. Cool. As you can see, I have not mounted the brake caliper yet. I like to put that on after I put on the wheel because I find it way easier to mount the wheel. And all you have to do is line up the axle and then you can put the brake caliper on afterwards. All right, I like to sit down when I put on the wheel. That way I could use my 2 feet below me to support the wheel and I can lift it up and down as needed. I'm going to use my left hand to slide the axle through. Now we've already put a little bit of grease on the axle. Don't need to put on a ton because it is the bearings that roll on the wheel. The wheel is not rolling around the axle. So the grease is just to ensure that you can get this stuff in and out when you work on it. So now that we've got this loosely fitted, I'm going to finger tighten the axle nut just a little bit, and then we're going to mount up our brake caliper assembly. So now we are torquing down our brake caliper mount to 30 Newton meters. That converts also to 22 foot-pounds. Now it is time for us to torque down our axle bolt right here. There's a few different ways we can do that. I'm going to show you the way to do it if you don't have the actual tool for holding the axle in place. Instead, we're going to be using the fork lug to do that, and I'm going to show you how. So this is the tool that you would use to hold the axle. I understand majority of you do not have this tool, so I'm going to show you how to hold the axle and torque down the nut without having this tool. So in order to do that, we first want to make sure that our axle is sticking out about the width of a quarter past our axle lug. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to hand tighten these axle pinch bolts. What that's going to do is prevent our axle from rotating when we torque down the axle nut. That's why I'm doing these by hand right now, because it doesn't really matter if you torque them to the proper spec, because afterwards you're going to have to loosen them back up to verify that this fork tube is straight. Now it is time to torque that down to spec. We looked up that in the manual and we have it called out to be 88 Newton meters, which converts to something in foot-pounds. We'll let you know. Now that these back pinch bolts have been tightened down, these pinch bolts are still loose on this side. And to recap, we've already mounted and torqued down our brake caliper as well. So essentially we have the front wheel aligned how we want it to be aligned. And we're going to be applying our torque spec, or applying a torque to this last. So we have this set up at 88 Newton meters, which turns out to be about 65 or about 64 foot-pounds. Excellent. So now that is tight. What we're actually going to go ahead and do now is we're going to loosen up this side again. Now, if we remember, we have about the width of a quarter sticking out for the axle. Is loosen up these pinch bolts right here. You're going to see our axle is going to slide in just a little bit. Cool. So now you can see the axle just barely is recessed, or it's almost flush with our axle bracket. Our fork lug came out this way just a little bit, and it is in its resting position. What we don't want is the fork lug to be pushed in too much. We don't want it to be pulled out too much. You kind of just push it and move it a little bit, you'll see where it naturally wants to rest at. And that's what we're looking for. This rest spot right here. So now we know both forks are exactly parallel as they should be. And now it is time to do our final torque on our axle pinch bolts. We got our torque wrench spec to 15 foot-pounds. That's what the manual calls out. And we're going to go ahead and take our time, building these up to the proper torque spec. As you see, we're going to apply it equally to both of the axle pinch nuts. So we're not going to go from 0 all the way up to the 15 foot-pound torque spec. Now, if some of you are watching, you think this looks a little awkward, I agree. We're trying to do it in a way to where it's easy for you guys to watch versus how I would work on a bike if, well, we're not videoing it. Excellent. So now that we have these, now that we have the axle bolts torqued down, it's time to apply our brake cover guard, and we are done and ready to ride. Now it is the time to apply our front disc brake cover. I personally am not too big of a fan of them. Anything that's going to bend your plastic cover is going to bend your disc anyways, but they do look pretty cool. The torque spec on this, again, is about 7 foot-pounds. These are pretty easy to strip out as well, so I'm going to do these by hand. Beautiful. This thing now is ready to ride.